the best way to keep a secret, is when it's just one person, because you're absolutely right. No one's going to tell on you. And that's why, you see a lot of people, get killed, in trials. What's up, everyone? So today we have a question from Chris, who says, probably the best thing to say to the police if you get pulled over would be as little as possible. Looking back at everything, do you think the biggest liability was your cousin? If you did it again, would you try and do everything solo? One other question. How did you prepare to become a Darknet vendor? Darknet Bible, Dread subs. So all really good questions. I'll address each one as a layer. So right off the bat, your first statement about, what to say when you get pulled over is absolutely accurate. I said it before here, I'll say it again. When you have a group of people who say to you at any point, anything you say will be used against you, probably not a good idea to, misconstrue those people as friends or allies or trustworthy individuals. Those same people are going to tell you, do the decent thing, just be honest. They're going to, preach a lot of that morality, and none of it's going to be for your benefit. So it's definitely, that's great advice. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have no obligation to talk, right? Unless you have a contract that says that you have to speak to person XYZ. I don't care if it's a cop, if it's a fed, if it's a teacher, if it's a Jehovah's Witness knocking on your door. You have no obligation to speak to anyone at any point unless they can produce a contract that shows that you agreed to do that in a consensual way. You willingly signed that contract. So the other thing to keep in mind is that at the end of the day, a lot of the times they're going to try to entrap you. Do you know how fast you were going? That's one of them right there. Did you not see that stop sign? Whether you say yes or no, it's going to be an introduction. They could even just say, how you doing today? And basically what they're trying to establish is some form of rapport to get a back and forth dialogue with you. And that right there should, the fact that they're manipulating the situation like that alone should be a massive red flag. So, as far as the liability goes, I did a lot of, in my research, I had done a lot of assessment of risk and mitigation of it. I did the very best I could to try to mitigate, any liability or risk that I had out there. And I think I did a really, pretty good job of it, for a guy who didn't have much resources. But I would definitely agree that, and one other, the best way to keep a secret, is when it's just one person, because you're absolutely right. No one's going to tell on you. And that's why, you see a lot of people, get killed, in trials, witnesses get killed, man. Because if that happens and someone dies, who's going to tell on you then? So if you're going to do crime, you obviously are, yes, absolutely better off to do it yourself. I'm not advocating anyone do crime. I'm just saying, as a hypothetical. But if I had to redo it again, would I do it solo? It's tough because, yeah, obviously I would. And I would just be like, hey, obviously I'm not going to expand too much. I'm going to only do what I'm capable of doing. That's if someone put a gun to my head and said, you're going to be a Darknet vendor. Other than that, I wouldn't do it just because, I said this before, the ROI is trash. The return that you're going to get is nothing compared to, if you go and you start a legitimate business, and we've covered this before that, that drug dealer tax is 100% and then prison time, and then possibly restitution. So, you have all those factors that go into it. And if you're paying for a lawyer, again, that's another expense. So, all those things. So I wouldn't do it again just because of that. It's a really bad way to make money. If you're like, someone put a gun to my head, they're like, hey, you're going to be a criminal. You have to be a criminal. What are you going to do? I would probably say I'm going to do white collar crime. Yes. Because I've seen those guys, make, or steal from organizations, $5, $10, $20 million. And, get 6 months. It's crazy. If you were to sell that same amount of drugs and make that in profit, it'd be like 300 years in prison, So that's really crazy. And drugs are investigated a lot more than, white collar crimes. It's just a lot of white collar crimes are a lot more involved. A lot of the times, in my personal opinion, from what I've seen, they're committed by more intelligent people. And that's because the people with more means, more affluence. These are people who maybe had a formal, good education. Maybe they went to a school that was better than the shitty ass public school that the drug dealer went to, or they had more, economic opportunities in their life, which is awesome. It's just funny how you could have that CEO who ends up in federal prison, with that guy that was selling crack. I try to teach people as much as I can and help people actively fight, against corrupt organizations like the BOP, which is the Bureau of Prisons, federal prison system. And, you hear people like, well, those people that are there, they deserve to be there. They're criminals. Yeah, I would say that some of them do, You have psychopaths, sociopaths, and sadists who just like to hurt people that exist there. That's not even up for debate. But you also have, nonviolent drug offenders. You have people who, you have people who made mistakes, and you have people who didn't actually do anything. And obviously that last category is not the majority. It's definitely the minority. But they exist. I think the last estimation that I saw was 100,000 innocent people are convicted and doing time in this country out of the 2.1, 2.4, 2.6, whatever it is now, million that are actively doing time. Way off on a tangent. But as far as bringing risk down, if I was going to be a darknet vendor again, if I had to be, then yeah, I would probably do it alone. And if I knew I had to do it alone, it would be another reason for me not to do it, because it is a ridiculous amount of work, to do all this stuff. I mean, doing what I did normally when I was vending, whether it was growing cannabis or making moonshine or, research and development, so that's a real thing. Or, just packaging stuff up, cleaning, all those kind of different things. It was something that's very, very involved. I mean, you're talking about a minimum, daily 12 hours a day, and there's no weekends off. There's no vacations. There's none of that. My cousin took vacation. She'd be like, I'm going to Rhode Island for a week. And she'd tell me the day before she goes. And I'm like going nuts because, now I have to wait a little bit, take the orders, and then go on vacation mode. Or just try to convince her to only take 3 days. That way, I have enough time to be able to take these orders and then have them sent out as soon as she comes back. So it's a very difficult thing, especially if the person you're working with is not as committed or, they're not a workaholic. And, I'm working, I'm typically working 15, 16, sometimes an hour, hours a day, or, at a minimum 12. So doing that and then saying, whoa, you're also going to be shipping the packages too. I think it would have gotten to a point where it just would have been too much. That would have been way too much to actually do as one person. And I'm sure there are people who do it. The majority of vendors that I've seen or I've discussed that have gotten busted don't. And there's a reason for that. It's a lot of work. It's the same reason why you don't see, major corporations that are, an individual. It just, it's too much work. Now, I mean, with AI nowadays, there might be some way around that. You could, you download maybe GPT for all, and have it help me respond to stuff. But it's just at the time that didn't, that wasn't a realistic option. The GPT for all didn't exist. So there's that. Now, to answer your other question, as far as preparing, it was just a lot of searching, a lot of OSINT, a lot of looking. I've mentioned, prior cases before. So dread didn't exist when I started looking into stuff and started vending. There was no dread. There was like Reddit and, the darknet markets there, the sub, which was banned. But even there, there wasn't too much information that was disclosed there because it's the ClearNet. So you didn't really see a lot of people talking about things like logistics, which is some of the stuff that I talk about, like in my DEF CON, speech, talk about, the specifics around OPSEC regarding mailing and logistical things like that. And, that stuff just wasn't out there. It wasn't out on the ClearNet, and it was very difficult to learn about those things inside of the darknet. And it was just something that just a lot of reading and a lot of trying to piece things together, a lot of looking for open sources of information, like the Postal Inspector's, handbook and statements, by USPS, all that kind of stuff. It was just a ridiculous amount of research. There are the resources, a lot of that information is more public. And that's, of course, that's probably because of me, but that information's always been out there. It's just a matter of putting it all together. So, that's why I have no qualms, hopping on here and discussing it, because whether you're talking about, the military looking at things from an OPSEC standpoint, where they're going to starve their enemy for intelligence and information, that's all we're talking about. These methodologies are universal. And it's like, if you read, 2,000 years ago or whatever, you read The Art of War, it was applicable, not only if you were a general, but in business too. And it's still applicable, right? A lot of those practices and principles that exist are still things that you could put into motion and utilize and, take advantage of. And they're just kind of like timeless, to some degree, things that are going to be implemented. So I think, trying to ban that, is not something that's going to happen. Again, way off topic. So, the Darknet Bible, yes, when it first started out, I did go through it. It wasn't really a major resource to me because a lot of the information that's in it is, it's already pretty well known. A lot of it's just common sense. So with that said, I definitely, I wouldn't, first off, I wouldn't do it again. If I had to be a criminal again, it would probably be ripping off a credit card company or, something like that. Or a bank, high interest bank, can't steal from a thief. Or, the last thing, holding up four fingers. The last thing, would be, I would just do it by myself. And I do think that having anyone else involved is a massive liability. I also think that if you're going to run any kind of, major operation, it's going to be a team effort, So the trick would be, how do I disconnect that and kind of proxify it where, maybe it's like, instead of, me sending out the packages, maybe I use an alternative. Because back when I was doing it, there was a lot less resources around, as far as logistics go. I've had people be like, well, why don't you just throw stamps on it, and send it out that way? I'm like, yeah, that's a great idea. Except if I'm shipping 8 pint-sized mason jars, a gallon of moonshine, that's, it's not something that's going to fit in a blue box, If I want tracking on it, it's not something that I can't just throw stamps on it. And, so even if it's something I can fit in a blue box, I'm not going to have tracking with it, People are like, well, you can buy, postage online and print them out. And again, that goes back to the issues with the printer. And it's like, okay, well, with the micro printing and all that I've talked about before. So even if we look past that, you're still going to have, issues. I want to say it was episode 5 in Darknet Demystified, where I talked about, this guy who had bought a ton of postage. We bought 1,500 pre-postage thing. He just had to put the address on. He had like the QR code or whatever set up on. He could just slap it on. And when they busted him, like they had his account and they had every single package that he had ever sent. So for me, from my research, what I had found, and again, I'm not perfect. I'm sure there is a great way to do it that I just didn't exist then, or I didn't know about. Trying to put all of this stuff together, and plan ahead for 6 months and get everything you need to actually execute this plan, set everything up is no easy task. I don't, envy the people who are Darknet vendors to this day. It's a horrible job. So, it's just, you're constantly hunted. You have to be constantly on your toes. And, even the guys or gals who say I'm done and they retire, like say they get $20 million, they retire, they're done, they're out. You never know if you're good. You never know if there's going to be that knock on the door. You never know if, at 3 a.m., that door's not going to get busted down, when you're off to serve a 15-year bid. I think in a lot of ways, I was lucky that I was busted because it made it so that I didn't have to have that worry, that anxiety. I'm not really one that gets anxiety. I'm not really one that worries too much. I kind of see it as a waste of energy. If I have the energy to get nervous and worry about something, what the next step's going to be is going to be like, why am I freaking out about this? And I'm going to go hop online and I'm going to start researching how to fix whatever it is I'm worried about, or see if there are any solutions, or if anyone else has ever experienced the same thing, because the internet is so big and there's so much information on there that it's almost like you can solve any problem that exists. And it's like, if you go on Startpage or Google and you punch in, what's the meaning of life? You're going to get so many answers back that sometimes the issue is not finding an answer, but sifting through the answers. And that's where learning about things like OSINT, kind of come into play, or being able to do research and be competent with it. It's Google Dorks, or, just learning the basics of that, research. So I hope that answers your question. I know I went off on multiple tangents, but I hope that answers your question, and I will see you guys in the next video.